Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin. We have Jonathan over here.
Hello.
And today we're going to be mainly talking about all the cases that have been filed against the Trump administration and sort of where we are with those. But before we do, I think, Jonathan, you wanted to say something about the roller coaster that we've been on regarding tariffs.
Yeah, it's kind of. I think it's just hard to ignore it. I mean, right? And as we're recording today on Wednesday, Trump has capitulated for a lot, but not all. We haven't capitulated with China, and of course, Trump and all his sycophants claim it's like 8-dimensional chess that Trump is playing, and we're stupid for not seeing this all along. But he has stepped back all the reciprocal tariffs. So at least as of the last time I looked at the news, we have a 10% baseline tariff on everything. And then I think 125% are we up to with China now?
I think it's 104%.
I think he upped it again, though, because China.
Oh, maybe. See, who knows?
a lot of tariff on China, with the inconvenient fact to think that that's still almost $500 billion worth of trade we have with China. And again, China's not paying this. We are, right? This is a tax on us, right? Nobody else pays for it but Americans. One way or another, we're going to have to pay for it. But briefly, just to kind of go over where we're at, right? We got a 90-day pause because Trump basically seems like he was crapping his pants, right? The stocks were cratering. The bond market got shaken, which is really a bad sign. Usually the bond market is a place you go for security when the stocks and things are going wrong, but people are starting to have doubts about the U.S., about our economy, and so they're selling off bonds. And we had to offer, the bond sellers have to offer higher returns to get people to try to hopefully buy. At the same time, oil prices are plummeting to, I believe, a 4-year low. And as we might remember, the oil people kind of have Trump's ear, right? So we have a 90-day pause. Then stock market immediately took off as something like 9% gain on the S&P or something. Big gains, but no pause for China, right? So the bigger picture is it's still complete chaos. Nobody knows what's going to happen from one minute to the next. Best example of this, Trump's trade rep was in front of Congress at a hearing, and he didn't know, when this happened, didn't know it was coming. And Congress people are a little upset about this. Go figure. Right? So where we're at right now is just a complete mess.
Right. And so that's why we wanted to sort of take a break from all the chaos and talk about something that's a bit more slow moving, which are the courts. The courts are as slow as molasses, and we're just going to do our check-in. Yep. So there's been a lot of hand-wringing about some recent rulings that SCOTUS has made on, say, temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions. So what we want to do is talk about some of these cases, kind of go through the jargon and make it easier to digest. Because what is an administrative stay? What's a preliminary injunction? There's a lot of stuff that's going on, and we just want to make it easier for our listeners and viewers to understand. And we're going to look at 3 categories.
Before we do, though, one quick point, just reinforcing what you're saying. For the non-terminally online and news readers like us, SCOTUS is the Supreme Court, right? Just want to mention that for anybody who's not acronym familiar, just so we're not starting with a deficit. The other thing I wanted to say quickly is that when we're talking about things legal and courts, I have to have a beer. So I have a beer for this week in our continuing saga of trying to get Russian River to be our sponsor. It's an interesting beer. They've sort of Brooklyn Brewing started this thing about trying to have more sustainable grains. And so this beer, Fonio, is brewed with a Fonio grain, which is an old ancient African grain that grows in miserable conditions, doesn't need a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer. And so they're brewing some beers to highlight it. This one is a Belgian style ale. It's actually pretty solid. It can be a good replacement if the tariffs come back in, right? Really solid Belgian style stuff. There's a little bit more interesting kind of fruit stuff in the background that I guess is supposed to come from this grain. I'd never had it before, so new to me as well. It's interesting kind of stuff. Very traditional Belgian style ale with a little bit of twist on it from the grain. If you can't get Russian River, which I know a lot of you can't, Brooklyn Beer has a Fonio beer as well. I think theirs is a pale ale though, so it'll different profiles. And of all people, Guinness is making a Fonio stout. So plenty of stuff out there to try if you want to try some of these different grains. And I always like trying different things like this just to see what's going on with the flavors. So hopefully that'll carry me through this discussion.
All right. So I hope everyone has their beer because we're going to go through a little bit of legal jargon so that things are a bit easier to understand. So I think the first phrase that we're going to talk about is habeas corpus. I'm sure if you remember history, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. So all that means is you have the right to challenge the legality of your detention. So you're going to see that a lot with these immigration cases. Irreparable harm. I think this is where a lot of people are trying to force a particular narrative into what it means. So most of the time, irreparable harm just means it can't be fixed with money or by a court ruling. So some examples of irreparable harm are, say, the loss of voting rights, being deported to a country where you're not going to be able to come back. So say North Korea, harm to reputation, trade secrets, things like that.
The death penalty, good example.
Yeah, it's a really good example. So I've seen a lot of folks try and say, oh, the government is going to have irreparable harm if they're forced to do something, or the reputation of the United States is going to be harmed by doing stupid stuff. That's not what irreparable harm is from a legal perspective, but it shouldn't surprise us if they start making these arguments in court, because in court, you're supposed to make as many arguments as possible.
Well, to an extent that, I mean, you're not supposed to make up fanciful things that you know aren't appropriate. And so
right, you don't want to be sanctioned.
You do see judges haul people onto the carpet for doing stuff that's ridiculous. So that's a fine line to walk. And I think something we want to talk about later is if the Trump administration is acting in good faith, and what that really means. And so we'll get back to that, because I think some of what they're doing sort of crosses the line. Like you said, you want to have all the arguments that make sense for your side, but you don't want to be making stuff up.
Right. So then I also want to talk about temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions. And all that means is the court is telling someone to stop. So a temporary restraining order, that's for a very specific period of time, no more than 14 days usually. And you don't need both sides there at a hearing. The judge can just say, oh yeah, we're going to issue a temporary restraining order. And the criteria for that is generally, are you going to succeed on the merits? And is there going to be irreparable harm?
So just to explain those terms a little bit more, right? The idea, I think the easiest way to think of a temporary restraining order is like a timeout in a sports game. It's like, hold on, stop, let's hold on a second. And you're right, the criteria is usually the judge thinks you have a good chance of winning on the merits, meaning they think you might win in the end. So since you might win in the end, we can stop things just to figure out where we're at, make sure we don't rush too far ahead. So yeah, I think that, and then when you get into the next level, it's the preliminary injunction, which again, same kind of thing. They're thinking you're going to win, and so they're not going to let the other side go too far ahead with what they're up to. Kind of like a longer timeout, maybe like a halftime, if we're going to keep a sports analogy going.
But it's much stronger. You actually have arguments on both sides, and then the judge will issue a ruling, and those stick for a while. They can be appealed, whereas temporary restraining orders are generally not appealable. And so you've seen in several cases already that someone might have a temporary restraining order denied, but they're granted a preliminary injunction. Mm-hmm. It's all about the level of scrutiny in terms of irreparable harm and whether or not you're likely to win the case. And
to make things more fun, in a number of these cases, and it's not unusual, judges will issue a ruling and then like a preliminary injunction, but then put a pause on their own ruling so that the plaintiff who was affected by the stop can appeal before the stop goes into effect. So there's all kinds of multiple layers of basically judges say, hold on, but you might not have to hold on yet until the other superior judges tell you whether or not you have to hold on.
Right. So I think my favorite is an administrative stay of a preliminary injunction. So let's say the government does X, the government is enjoined, so they have to stop doing X, but then the government appeals to, say, the circuit court, and then there's a stay, and so then the government can do X.
Right.
And it's like, what?
Let's fill in your variables for a second. Say you're deporting people to El Salvador. Don't know where I got that idea. But yeah, a judge can say, you know what? You have to stop this. But I'm not sure if the appeal will hold, so I will tell you, I'm going to tell you have to stop this, but then I'm going to say you don't have to stop it quite yet. We'll see what the next higher court has to say and let them make the decision. So there's a lot of ruling and punting and carrying on, but the net result is that in these important cases, the judges tend to be a little bit, let's say conservative, not in the political realm, but conservative in putting a whole change of impact without acknowledging that they could be wrong and letting the appeals court have a shot too.
Right. And to even add more to the confusion, you could have a case such as Abrego Garcia versus Noam. So Kristi Noam is the head of DHS. That is challenging the U.S. government's deportation of Abrego Garcia. But then you can also have Noam versus Abrego Garcia, where DHS is challenging the preliminary injunction. So you have two cases, and then the names are mixed up, and it gets really confusing when you're trying to look up a specific case. So just be aware of that. And then lastly, I want to talk about what is the shadow docket or emergency docket. So most of the time when you're exposed to the Supreme Court, you hear about a case. It is decided by the district court. It is then decided by the appellate court. And then if the Supreme Court says, yeah, I want to understand the merits of the case, and then I'll make a ruling, they'll take up the case. Now, what the shadow docket is, it's the Supreme Court ruling on the preliminary injunctions. So in most of these cases, they haven't even discussed merits yet. And so when it goes to the Supreme Court via shadow docket, you don't necessarily see the judges themselves putting their names on an order, right? It might just say per curiam opinion. And then the logic of the ruling isn't really explained all that much. They could just say something along the lines of, oh, you lack standing here. We're not going to discuss the merits of the case or likelihood of success. We're only deciding this narrow issue. And during the Biden administration, the Fifth Circuit, which sort of handles Texas and stuff like that, they really leveraged the emergency docket effectively on their end. And it got to the point where the Supreme Court started getting pissed off, and they had to say, guys, you're abusing this. You need to stop.
Somehow, the Fifth Circuit got to enjoin a lot of Biden proposals during his time. So, I mean, what I think is useful for our listeners and viewers to know about this is that, yes, it's supposed to be just administrative stuff. Are people following the right procedures with what's happened so far? And they're generally not ruling on the merits, except more often than not, they kind of really are, because it's very rare, at least in my take on it, for the court to decide something in a way that they're not going to fundamentally lean later on, right? The things they don't agree with, they uphold the stays. Or the things they don't agree with, they don't allow to move forward. The things they do agree with, they tend to allow to move forward, right? And then they tell us that it's simply for administrative reasons. It's a hard sell, I think, to make.
Right. And I think the data supports what you're saying, because the Obama and Biden administrations didn't have as much success in the shadow docket as much as the Trump administration did during his first term. During Trump's first term, he was remarkably successful in using the emergency docket to get the outcomes that he wanted.
We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about what this all means. And I know we're going to have a very lively discussion on what the court is up to and what we should take from this. But I think getting there by looking at these procedures, I think, is useful to do, because you figure out how the court acts, how it's supposed to act, how it tells us it's acting, and what it really means when we get a little bit further down past this shadow docket kind of stuff. Well, so hopefully that section wasn't too painful, and hopefully we made it as interesting as it could be, and hopefully you have a beer to make it a little bit more interesting. In any case, we're going to move ahead now into a little bit more of the meat of the issue. Mentioned before that there are kind of three baskets of cases we wanted to talk about. One is sort of the DOGE firings, hacking away at the government and just kicking people out of their jobs. The second part is funding, right? Trump cutting off funding, not allowing money to go to certain places. And then the third thing is immigration, right? And that doesn't even get into these other, we could talk about sort of cases that are useful to look at all over the board because there's all kinds of outrages.
Yeah, like the transgender military ban. Like there are dozens of cases out there that are being litigated right now.
Like the AP suing for being not allowed in because they won't say Gulf of Mexico, right? Or because they will say Gulf of Mexico and won't say Gulf of America. You have all these law firms suing because Trump is trying to punish law firms. It's like we're cutting down. Hopefully, just to kind of show how things are working, but you can kind of apply the conclusions I think that we're going to come up with to these other cases as well.
Yeah, regarding the AP, for instance, the district judge, already enjoined that. Basically, the judge said that you can't discriminate specifically against the AP. It's a violation of the First Amendment. So
oddly, they're going to appeal.
He's enjoined. Yeah.
We'll see this in the Supreme Court before too long as well, I'm guessing.
Again, there's been a lot of hand-wringing, right? Republicans in Congress, after Amy Coney Barrett betrayed the Trump administration as if she owes him anything, they said that, well, these judges are unelected and Trump was elected democratically. Therefore, these rulings are undemocratic.
You want to give a little bit more background there for which ruling you're referencing? Because I'm not sure a lot of people are familiar with it.
Okay, so this is regard to USAID. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. I just wanted to sort of set the stage for how people are reacting. Sure. So partisans, no matter the partisans on either side, are generally not going to look at the rationale for these rulings. They are just looking for an outcome. And so Republicans in Congress, they want a specific outcome. They want Trump to do what he was allegedly elected to do.
Nice use of allegedly in a legal focused podcast. But I think you can even go beyond that. I don't think. I mean, the partisans just want their side to win. Mm-hmm. They don't care beyond that at all. And in some ways, if you're partisan, it kind of makes sense because in a lot of ways, these explanations aren't so much, hey, this is how we got there. It's, well, this explains that we made this decision, right? It kind of, I'm of a strong belief that a lot of times, probably most of the time, the decision comes first and then they figure out how they're going to justify it. So I don't blame the partisans so much for not focusing on the rulings or on the rationale for the rulings, but I do get more. I think they deserve a lot of blame for overreacting when they lose, because you should expect to lose once in a while.
Right.
It's not
sure.
Nobody should be going through life thinking I'm right all the time. And we have a lot of that.
Yeah. And on both sides, there are going to be Republican judges who make bad rulings. They might wrongly enjoin the government or something along those lines. The Democrat appointed judge, for instance, might overreach. This is normal. It's going to happen. Both sides are going to overreach sometimes, and sometimes judges are going to make bad rulings. And that's why we have the appeals process. We have a process in place to iron all these things out. So I think that's a good transition point for the three types of categories that we're going to talk about. The first category that we're going to talk about are the firings. So if you're not aware of what's been going on, DOGE has gone through various agencies and they've decided to cut thousands and thousands of workers across various departments. So for instance, the VA or Department of Education, Department of State, so on and so forth. So there are various legal challenges throughout the country that are addressing this issue through various avenues. So for instance, in Maryland, you have the union for the employees asking the courts to enjoin the government and say, hey, you can't fire these employees. And that was granted a preliminary injunction. In San Francisco, on the other hand, a group of nonprofits have asked the courts to say, hey, we are affected by the firings. So we believe we have standing and we want you to also enjoin the government from doing these firings. And the judge gave a preliminary injunction, and then the Ninth Circuit upheld that injunction. They basically rejected the administrative stay, if you want to use that legal jargon that we just taught you.
To cut to the chase, yes, this judge said, sure, stop. They can stop. You have standing. The appeals court said, you know what? Okay. But then in a twist that's probably not too surprising, the Supreme Court said, you know what? Actually, no. And What was a little bit surprising is the ruling was 7-2, so they had a little bit of liberal support in their one, to be fair. So not a whole lot, but one to overturn this and allow Trump to go ahead with it. And what's interesting to me, right, is sort of on the face, this shouldn't be illegal because you're not allowed to fire these. You're only allowed to fire these probationary workers, is what it was. People have only been there a short period of time. Allowed to fire them, but only for performance. And they clearly didn't do that. But we're going through all these machinations to get there in a way that hopefully everybody's happy with. But I'm not exactly sure. I'm not expecting the Supreme Court to end up coming down on the side of the employees.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one to really look out for is the one in Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if the Supreme Court looks at this preliminary injunction coming out of Maryland and they say, no, you got that wrong, then I think effectively the ruling has been made, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the time to actually discuss the merits and for it to go all the way up to the court, it's going to be months, possibly even over a year. Mm-hmm. All those fired employees are going to get new jobs. The case is going to end up being moot.
Hopefully.
So, well, I don't know. It depends if you're a whose side you're on, right?
Well, if I'm on the side of the employees, if they're out for several months, hopefully they'll be able to find a new job.
Yes.
But I mean, so here's a scenario. Would you be surprised if the Supreme Court said, you know what, this needs to go to the NLRB, and so we push it down there, and they'll deal with it. But then the NLRB, since Trump has hamstrung it, can't do anything. They can't even meet, right? So they could be effectively killing it that way. So I'm not holding my breath for a good outcome for the 16,000 fired workers.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. I do think that they got the ruling right with the San Francisco one. Nonprofits having standing and the ability to sue just because government workers got fired, that's a stretch, in my opinion.
Well, here's the thing with that, and let's talk about this later on in more detail, but the court has done a really great job of manipulating standing to fit its ideological goals, right? It's not a surprise that they said no standing here because it doesn't fit what the views are of the majority of the court. But if you have been paying attention to what they've done previously in standing, just on an objective look at standing, it's not as much of a stretch as it would seem to be, I think.
All right, so let's move on to the next category, which are the grants. And this is where it's interesting because this is where Amy Coney Barrett got a lot of heat. And we have two cases. The first one involves USAID, and it involved grants that were going out for work that was already completed. And the circuit courts issued an injunction and said, hey, you have to keep paying the money. The work is already done. There will be irreparable harm to, say, folks in Africa if things shut down and people die. On the other side, the Supreme Court issued an administrative stay. So basically they overturned the injunction. And what that means is that the government doesn't have to pay the grants for recipients of Department of Education grants, specifically in relation to teacher training. And the reason for that is it's the states who are receiving these grants, and the states are not going to be irreparably harmed given a particular time period if they don't receive the funds.
Right. And there's a lot of hair splitting going on.
Exactly. And again, like I think you're right that you can sort of predict how this was going to happen based on just the leanings of the court.
Mm-hmm. And I think you could sort of extend it further, looking at sort of a follow-up case that they've now cut off grants. They're threatening grants to Title I schools if they don't get rid of all their DEI policies. So continuing down this same path, the Trump administration is being empowered every time they win something. They think, hey, let me push it a little bit further. And it doesn't seem like the court's going to stand up to them on these side of education grants. And they're going to push it as far as they can until the court does.
Yeah. But again, I want to emphasize that the merits of these cases haven't even been decided. We're basically only talking about money going in and money going out for very specific causes. And in the case of USAID, where you have these nonprofits that were receiving funds for work they already did, the Supreme Court said, yeah, we're not even going to look at that. You know, things are good in the sense that the circuit court ruled correctly, and so those funds are going to go through. So Amy Coney Barrett has been simultaneously a hero and a villain for both the left and the right. But I think you could read that and say, you know what, she's actually trying to operate in good faith here and trying to do the right thing. But, I think it's also instructive to actually read the dissent by, it was like Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Thomas regarding the disbursement of funds for USAID. They were livid.
I think that's sort of Alito's constant state of mind, to be fair.
Yeah. But I think it's good to read the rulings every now and then just to sort of get a feel for what their ethos is, right?
And I think you're right to mention a dissent, because I do think you probably get a more accurate picture of what they're thinking in a dissent. Mm-hmm. Because as I mentioned before, I think a lot of the rulings, to explain the rulings, are there to justify something that they wanted to get to in the first place, right? It's, well, this is what I want. How can I explain in a way that make people at least upset? In a dissent, you're like, well, hell, I didn't get what I want. I'm just going to give a broadside to the other side. And Alito is he does that a lot. If he's in the dissenting group, he lets you have it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that those are, as far as a Supreme Court ruling can be interesting, those are probably ones to take a look at.
The last category is immigration. And so we have two cases there. The first case involves the Venezuelans who were deported through the Alien Enemies Act. And the other one involves the man who was accidentally sent to El Salvador. And for our listeners, I am using air quotes for accidentally here. Yeah. The government did admit that it was an error, but I think it's one of those things where you're just reckless and don't give a shit.
Yeah. And because I find it very hard to believe that when this guy was arrested and bundled onto a plane and sent to El Salvador, he never once mentioned that he had protected status and shouldn't be deported. I'm going to say he probably might have made that known to somebody at some point in time. But again, when we're talking about, these are the only cases that we're going to be talking about right now, because there's a lot of other cases and going on in the deportation stuff, like the guy from Colombia, the woman who was from, I can't remember what school, but also arrested, and they're trying to deport people that have actual green cards. Just yesterday, the day before, they canceled, I think, hundreds of student visas for various reasons. Some they didn't even explain why, and now they're threatening to deport these people. That's going through the court. So there's all kinds of immigration suits going on right now. These are the ones we're going to focus on because I think you're right that they're the most salient.
Yeah, so the Abrego Garcia one, he's the man who had the autism awareness tattoo, which is a well-known gang symbol, of course, and he has a 5-year-old son who has autism. Now, I say that because that's just one side of the story. The other side of the story is that an immigration judge found him to be not guilty of being a member of MS-13, but he was accused of being an MS-13 gang member, and that fact wasn't really disputed. Now, again, we're not telling everyone that he's a criminal or anything like that, but the fact that a judge, an immigration judge, has that in writing, so to speak, from a legal perspective, that is relevant. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's true, of course, but from a process point of view, that is an important detail.
Well, I think another important detail is that he had a protection order because he was going through the process. I mean, I think that's the most important detail.
Yeah, agreed. So I don't want to get too bogged down into, he's this loving father, which one side has said, or he's like this vicious gang member that the other side has said. Those aren't relevant. What is relevant, as what you said, is he was not to be sent to El Salvador. His life would be in danger if you sent him to El Salvador.
I think you're 100% correct that it doesn't matter if he's a loving father. It doesn't matter if he's a gang member. It doesn't matter if he's the biggest scumbag to walk around on the streets of our country. The law is supposed to treat everyone the same. And that's the objection that these law. If you really, I mean, the wife was on CNN today, actually, when I was eating lunch, and they've had a long, yay. And it's sad for this woman, and I can see why her advocates want her out there to get sympathy. Mm-hmm. But to me, that's not, I don't care at all. I want this guy brought back because they violated the law. right? I don't care if he's a great guy. I mean, it's great that he's a great guy, and
Yeah.
I'm glad you think that of your husband. You should, but that's irrelevant. It's not, and it's again what the Republicans are doing on the other side. Oh, he's this horrible guy. It doesn't matter. I don't care. I want you to prove it, right? And that doesn't seem to be a lot to ask. The court in this case said, bring him back, right? And now that's the Supreme Court, and they're trying to figure out what to do with that. And that's an interesting saga for any number of reasons.
Yeah. So the judge gave a deadline in the preliminary injunction saying, hey, he must be back by this date. And then the Supreme Court stepped in and said, okay, I'm going to overrule this. I'm going to add a little bit more time so that we can discuss the merits and how this can actually be executed.
Which again sort of exposes the irreparable harm as a lie, because you can very easily be killed or maimed at that prison in El Salvador.
For sure. But at the same time, I do think that it is hard to get him back from. And
that's a completely different issue, though, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, agreed. Oftentimes when it comes to rulings, when you have some sort of a relief, it has to be feasible, right? Mm-hmm. And, there's going to be a whole bunch of jurisdiction issues. The government obviously is going to say, oh, well, this is a foreign policy thing, and we can't force another country to do this.
Well, yeah, they've already said that. They said, well, El Salvador has them now. We can't make them give them back. And that's, again, goes back to, do you believe they're acting in good faith? And I'm going to say, no. I think we could very easily make El Salvador do anything we want. So it's not a stretch to say, give him back, and they'll give him back. They just don't want to.
Right. So we'll keep an eye on that case, but I do think it's really interesting because it's like this mix of defiance and jurisdiction and all these other things. And I think that oftentimes, though, people look at the Supreme Court and they say, oh, this is this massive violation, when they just effectively only added like 72 hours before making a decision. But, again, courts are going to work slow. What constitutes irreparable harm? Hard to say. We agree that being sent to North Korea is probably irreparable harm. Being sent to Mexico, less so. I think with El Salvador, especially due to the fact that he was not supposed to be sent there because his life would be in danger, that is pretty close to irreparable harm. And that's why I think the judge issued the injunction, told him to come back. But again, feasibility, I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, so then brings us to sort of the larger immigration case, which is the idea of whether or not the Trump administration can use the Alien Enemies Act from the 18th century to deport people by claiming we are at war and under an invasion. Okay. And again, it's on its face seems like at best a stretch, right? And there have been some process through the courts of judges saying, you know what? No, this doesn't work, right? The Supreme Court has come in and kind of agreed, but kind of not, right? They've got a sort of a complicated thing. Yes, people have the right to due process, but only in the state of Texas, where they are right now. So it sort of opens things up for them rounding up more people, sending them somewhere else and sending them off, right? Because, hey, they're not in Texas. They're not required to have jurisdiction there. And clearly the Trump administration is already kind of playing games with where they're housing these people. They're taking them out of, say, New York and sending them to the Deep South, where oddly they expect the courts to be more favorable to them. But in any case, right, this is another saga where it's the courts are taking their time and really parsing out what they're saying they're ruling on.
Yeah. So ultimately what the court did was, in a 5-4 ruling, they overturned the temporary restraining orders. And so they granted the administrative stay. And so obviously the Trump administration, Republicans, are just really gung-ho about this. And they're saying, yeah, we won. Now, if you look at the ruling, I think it's pretty clear that all 9 justices are like, yeah, you're going to have to give these guys due process. Are you nuts? And the real disagreement is venue, as you said. And I think that cuts both ways, right? On one hand, you're right that having the venue be the District of Columbia is probably going to be more favorable towards the Democrats. And the district courts in Louisiana, Texas are going to be much more favorable towards Republicans. And really what it really boiled down to was, okay, how are you contesting this law? Are you doing this through habeas, which we mentioned in the beginning of the show, where you're challenging your actual detention? Well, if that's the case, then you have to go through the district courts. Or are you doing this through the Administrative Procedures Act, which would be in DC? And 4 justices believe that. Honestly, you and I don't care. I don't think our viewers should care. But that is kind of like the meat of the issue from a legal perspective. And I think what's interesting is 3 of the justices said we shouldn't even review this because, as we mentioned before, you're not supposed to review temporary restraining orders because they're so temporary that you can usually get to the preliminary injunction stage before you even resolve the TRO issue.
Kind of sum up where we're at now is there have been habeas petitions filed in both Texas and New York, kind of covering all their bases, and there have been some stays, some temporary relief has been granted. So it seems that right now they're not going to be able to send people off, except I was reading that the Trump administration is trying to think about how they can do it going through other venues. So who knows what this is going to be, which to me kind of brings me to sort of the implication I want to talk about, that a lot of this stuff is kind of like smokescreen for what you really want to get to. Because if you look at, say, the Alien Act, the Alien Enemies Act, on its face, it's nonsense to use this to deport illegal immigrants, right? It's designed to, and these people on the Supreme Court who are having doubts about what to do here, they claim to be originalists. Well, it's clear that the original intent of this law was to work in times of war, right? This is not that. And on its face, this law, it's not a coincidence this law hasn't been used, right? And it shouldn't be, it should be an easy layup to say, well, this doesn't apply, but they don't want to do that, right? This court is, the Supreme Court is very friendly to President Trump for these things. A lot of these, I mean, it's a 6-3 conservative supermajority. So we shouldn't be surprised that the rulings are going to lean conservative, right? And that's the problem I have with a lot of this. I mean, is the court acting in good faith in the merits of the cases? I'm not convinced, right? Are they inventing rationale to get to their preferred policy outcomes? That seems to make more sense to me, right? And I mentioned before the standing issue, where they're arguing, oh, well, these nonprofits don't have standing to sue. It's like, oh, well, I could see that if that was our standard approach to standing all the time.
Right.
Except back in the Biden administration, when they wanted to get past student loan forgiveness, the courts invented a new type of standing where states could sue because they might make less money collecting student loan payments, even though the federal government did it. But in Missouri, they created some sort of private company, not a government company, to oversee some tiny portion of student loans. And so they might have some sort of losses or not even losses, but unrealized profits if the student loans were forgiven. So they'll bend over backwards to create artificial standing if they believe in a political outcome. But the same rationale does not apply when they do not like the political outcome. So it's easy to be cynical about the court. And I think that I've fallen into that trap fully. But when I try to parse my way through the reasonings and get to, well, maybe they are. It's just blatantly political. And you can say, both sides are political in their own way. And in a way they are, right? But there's 6 conservatives and 3 Democrats. So you're going to have, if each justice is equally political, which I don't think is true, but even if they are, things are going to end up being far more friendly to conservatives than liberals. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see. And while I think it's like on the face of it, several of these things ought to be blatantly illegal, I will be pleasantly surprised if that's the way the Supreme Court ends up ruling.
Yeah. And, you and I disagree on the court probably more than any other issue. As
Possibly.
A lot of people probably know, I lean much more conservative when it comes to the Supreme Court. But I think you do have to call a spade sometimes. And the way they invented the standing for that Missouri case, it's bullshit. The Trump immunity case, where they effectively made the presidency a king, at least that's my take on it, complete bullshit. So I think it would be good if the people who are actually operating in good faith, especially from the conservative side, could help call a spade from time to time. That would be really useful here.
It would be very useful. Also very surprising. And just so people know, and just to kind of qualify where I am on the court, I'm not thinking Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not my favorite justice of all time. My favorite justice in my lifetime is David Souter, guy appointed by George H.W. Bush, who was a wild card.
Traitor Souter?
I loved reading his views because he took things on the merits, right? You couldn't predict which way he was going to go in the way you can predict, say, Ginsburg or Alito or Scalia or Thomas, right? You know how those people are going to or would have voted, right? Souter tackled things on the merits and pissed off everybody because he wasn't a reliable vote. We should have 9 of those people on the Supreme Court that are just there to make good rulings rather than fulfill some sort of political agenda. And I think from the rulings that we have seen and the rulings we probably will see, in my view, we're just reinforcing that we have 9 political people up there that are trying to get to the views that they think match their political ideology.
Yeah, so we'll have to keep an eye on these things, especially when it comes to Alien Enemies Act. I think that is something that is so egregious. I would be shocked as someone who leans conservative on when it comes to judicial philosophy if they support that in any way. So I'm going to be looking at the preliminary injunctions, and I'm hoping that the Supreme Court says, no, these preliminary injunctions are correct when it comes to the Alien Enemies Act. And, let's hope so, because, again, that is batshit crazy.
Yes, we'll need more beer to talk about that if that's not the case.
So anyways, having said all that, I hope we didn't bore everyone with, all these things, but it's important, right? If you care about resistance in terms of the Trump administration, this is it. These are your best bets. So they're important to pay attention to.
And I think even if you don't care about these issues, right, as we mentioned a little bit, and we'll unfortunately have to get back to at some point in time, each time the Trump administration wins when they get to infringe on somebody else's rights, they expand that, right? And am I thinking that I'm crying wolf or something or say the sky is falling when I'm thinking I'm a little concerned that they're going to try to expand some of these things to Americans, or is it realism? I don't know. Trump again yesterday opined that maybe we could think about sending American criminals to that prison in El Salvador, right? That's a big leap. That would be a complete abrogation of the Constitution, but he's talking about it already. This is the kind of thing where once you start infringing rights, and they pick the easiest people to infringe upon, right? Yes. These are people that most of them do not get much sympathy, right? And so it's easy to get people, the average person in the United States, like, yeah, okay, we don't need these people here, get them out, right? But once you do that, you've set the precedent that you can infringe on rights, and to stop there isn't a sure thing.
Right. So on that happy note,
we're doing a lot of that lately.
Yeah. Make sure you like, subscribe, tell your friends about it, and we will see you next week.